Okay, let's start though. Hello everyone. I think it's too loud. My name is Dmitry Vinnik. I'm a senior software engineer at Salesforce, based in Vancouver, Canada. And today's talk will be on building tests to build websites. But what it actually means is there are certain website building tools out there. You might haven't heard about Salesforce tool for building websites, which is called Lightning Bolt, but you most certainly heard about WordPress, which is actually quite popular these days. So basically what it provides you is the ability to create a website not only programmatically as you would do by writing a JavaScript code for the client side and serve whatever you choose to, but rather declaratively by using a set of tools, components, or whatever sets of tools you use to drag and drop those to the container and ultimately build the websites that can be used by non-technical users. Before we move on with the talk, I'd like to give a small outline what this whole presentation is going to be about. So as I just highlighted what those website builder tools are, I will talk about what actually motivated me to give this presentation. Then I will explain what is the main testing concept you should follow when you're working with the website builders. Then I will cover what the generalizing tests principles you should follow when you're writing the tests for applications like that. And ultimately, I move on the developers aspect of testing and what developers should have in mind when they develop a feature. And then to wrap it all up, I will give an example of if I were to be given a new feature, how I'll write test cases using Selenium or any other test framework, and to just highlight a few nuances of a WebDriver, which are especially important on the job of working with the website builders. So without further ado, I'll explain the motivation for this presentation. So website builders require testing to happen in two different contexts. So there is a design time, which involves working with the platform to declaratively or programmatically create a website just by having a container initially and drag and drop certain components that provide a functionality for the end user when they work with the final product of your website builder, which is a website. And by using this design context, you end up with the runtime, which is the actual website, which is the customer going to interact with. This presents us with the main challenge of website builders, because usually when you work with any other web application, there is just one context you have to keep in mind. It's either just design, if you're providing a set of tools, like let's say draw.io, which allows you to create the UMLs online. They just provide you with a toolkit, and you design something, and you're good to go. With this, however, you have to use one context to create another and work with both of them in parallel. So that's quite challenging, and there are a few aspects you have to know about if you were to be given a product like that. So the main testing concept, as I just mentioned, is that because there are two major contexts, you have to be able to separate design time versus a runtime. So the way to approach it, as we all know, Agile is currently quite a hot topic and the way to go in terms of methodology for majority of the projects. And when you think in Agile, you actually, by writing the stories, you assume personas or who's going to be a user of a feature that you're developing. And if you were to think on these two contexts from a persona perspective, you understand that when we talk about the design time, the persona, the main user of it, will be a designer, maybe a non-technical administrator, maybe actual hardcore developer, but it's all about building that website. So that's primary persona that's going to be working with this context. But if we were to speak about the runtime, you can see, the runtime, the main persona here is the guest user, authenticated user, depending on what kind of website you're building. But it's entirely different use case in here. So just by trying to imagine what the customers are for which context, it allows you to actually make that separation And with that separation comes the different way to test it. To go into more details of each individual context, let's start with the design time, because if we were to think about it, this is where everything starts. Because to have a runtime, you have to have a design time at first. Few highlights which you have to keep in mind when you're working with it is, as we all know, it's ideal to set up the data before you start your WebDriver session. But it's especially crucial in the design time because, as you've probably seen in the previous slide, there was a set of components you might see on your platform, basically that set of toolkits, which will require some sub-data to be provided to the context. So it means that design time is especially heavily relying on the underlying data, which has to be set up before you start your WebDriver session. As many talks before mine highlighted, the WebDriver has to be kept to the minimum for the runtime of a session. And to avoid that, make sure you set up data beforehand. Next few points about the focus of your work is on a page object. But you might say that the page object is what drives any WebDriver tests. But in this case, what I'm trying to highlight is the idea is that all those page objects are interconnected, and each subsequent page object actually gets defined by the caller. To explain it more is, if you were to think of this slide where if you are looking into one of the components, the one that says NTO experts here, this is a banner component. So if you define it as a page object, after you are clicking on it or selected by WebDriver, you're going to get the tool for this component, and that will be property editor. So that property editor and the attributes that you might see in it and might modify will be defined by the component itself. So basically, you have to understand that there is this tight and very close connection between the page objects. So your main focus, your main work is going to be done to highlight that binding between page objects. And those main patterns you have to keep in mind. It's just whatever pattern you prefer, whatever application you're writing for creating those page objects. If it's a plain POM or it's a page factory. When we get to the runtime, the few highlights are slightly different. So what's important here is that you basically work with a single container. I don't necessarily mean that you're going to have a huge single page object. You're still going to keep the software engineering concepts in mind of using decomposition and accessing each individual page object underneath one after another. But the idea is that the ready-to-be-used website is just a container with the component that you drag and drop in the design time. So here you're actually highlighting the relations of actions. So to better describe it, if you've seen a few slides before, had a website with the navigation menu. That navigation menu had these topics part on it. And if I were to write the code, I first access the container, runtime, which I'm not really interested in. It's just a container. So I access it, then I make a call and action, get me topics. That triggers the WebDriver not to find me that page object necessarily. I'm not interested in it. What I'm interested in making an action or making a call and actually click on this drop down and highlight and show me the topics underneath. And then I will make the main action that I'm most interested in select. I select a certain topic of the topics that were given to me by my previous action. That might sound similar to design time, but the difference here is the way you write it. The way you write is that you're following the pattern of a Fluent interface. It's not a Fluent interface that's a library provided by Selenium HQ on a GitHub. It's the pattern of actually connecting the page objects and their actions one after another by returning the object itself. It's what I believe Nikolai described yesterday during his session on the patterns. The reason for this interface, for this pattern to be used and primarily used here is because it should be different from the steps pattern that you deploy for a design time, because you're not interested in intermediate page objects. I only care to get the final point, to the final point of my action that I call select me the one of the topics. If you might see after I select it, gets highlighted here. And just one final point, when you are working on the runtime, because it's whenever you interact with the client side, you might have a web services underneath that actually connecting you to the server side and the business logic. Because the problem is your main goal is to represent the customer here, how the customer will use your website. So WebDriver is not exactly the customer because WebDriver might be too fast in this context. So let's say you have a search bar. If you have a WebDriver that enters the search term into the search bar and clicks search button. By the time it clicks on the search button, it's not necessary that the search term you just enter was already given to the search query that you have underneath. So if those were somehow decoupled, you have to make sure that when you enter the term and before you click the button, it was accepted and it's going to be used for the search and giving you the results. So to avoid that situation where you're actually just searching for the empty string because it wasn't yet accepted, you have to write and use the JavaScript Executor heavily here. So it's how you're going to keep in mind writing your production code of functions actually being stateful and have a completed state so you in tests can consume and know that web service that sets the term was completed, then I do the search using the search button. The next part of this presentation is basically to explain how you write the tests, regardless of the context. So you're trying to generalize them, make them independent of some implementations, like the templates you use underneath. So as I mentioned, the website builders are all about the set of toolkits, the set of tools you have, which are components, users, views, whatever you have there. And let's say you have 100 components in total, but I'm a user, developer. I don't want to see all those 100 components for my use case. I'm building a community, like a customer service community, that I'm only interested in components that allow my user to file a case, give me feedback, or just write an nasty comment or something. I'm only interested in about 20 components, not 100. So those components are basically split in multiple toolkits. But let's say different templates were to share those components. So if I write a test that focuses on a search through the UI, and that search component is used on both of these templates, I don't care which template it is. When I'm writing the test, it should be independent enough to be used on either of those templates. So what your primary focus should be is on this use case of a component. It has to exist independently of where it's located. You're only interested in it. Its selectors won't change. So that's how what I mean by generalizing tests for the templates. Then this graph, you might not see the font is quite small, but what I'm trying to show here is that there are a variety of browsers out there, and they are quite heavily used. So you cannot just omit certain web browser like Safari, and you most certainly support in your development, and hence you have to actually support it in your test framework. But again, when you write in your test, you most certainly don't care what WebDriver what driver is going to be deployed and what browser it will use. Unless there is some driver-specific issue with API is not being supported, you should never rely on a certain driver to run your test for. And your test should be run for all of those Chrome, Safari, Firefox, even IE, because it's still supported to some extent. So those implementations shouldn't bother you as much. The next part is what some people covered before me, but it's good to reiterate. I have a slightly different approach to this problem of how developers are involved in testing. So what ideas developers who work on features should keep in mind when they create something. So API first. You probably heard it a lot, but as I mentioned before, you have to be able to set up the data. And to do so, you most likely don't want to bring up the WebDriver to do that for you, creating the user context, creating views, components. Unless you're testing for it, you don't care about these implementations. So you should have ability to call the web services that set up all this information before you start your session. So that's one reason to use the API first. Another main reason that I'm most focusing on is you can actually avoid using WebDriver in the first place. With the scenarios I mentioned before with search, if I have two web services that say search, set the search term and actually triggers the search, if it triggers the search, returning me the set of results, the best idea is to actually just test those web services throughout your service tests and see that it actually finds it in the database. But I only will write a WebDriver to make sure that those results get displayed correctly. I don't validate the results in my WebDriver tests. So that's the actual reason to go API first. The second part of this is to have the TDD mindset or test-driven development mindset. It doesn't mean that you have to change the whole stack of writing tests first. That's quite complicated. What I'm trying to bring here is that when a developer working on their feature, if they were to write a DOM, they don't just think on a development perspective that I have to define class for my style sheets to work with it. I'm also writing the classes for WebDriver tests only. So as you see here, prod classes, prod action button, those classes can be heavily abused by developers if they want to. It can change throughout time. But the second set of classes that I will agree on will only be used by the WebDriver team. So it means we're making the agreement with the developer. They're not going to make any changes to those classes because it shouldn't affect them. It does not affect the UI. If it was to be removed, the entire test probably going to be removed because it's focused on that. So in that case, we're basically writing production code with tests in mind. So you're working in a collaboration because both yours and developer goal is the software quality first. Few best practices I'd like to highlight that been also mentioned throughout the talks. Some of it, my personal opinion, or coming from the experience of mine or my colleagues. For a few things you have to do. Abstract WebDriver. I can't emphasize enough how important it is not to care about implementation and the ways you search for the element. You only care about your interface. You don't care how it's done. And again, the Selenium is the open source product. It changes throughout time, and you want to keep yourself on the very edge of the technology because they might be fixing some bugs, some underlying issues, and hopefully performance. They use CSS selectors first. This is arguable, but if you keep my previous slide in mind, you understand that if you were to write a DOM with those separation of production, developer-based classes versus WebDriver classes, you understand that CSS selectors are quite neat here, because that's unique identifier. It's not going to change, because it's only going to be used by your team. Another important point is, just in general, try to set up your data before you start a web session. Only start it when it's needed, because as we all know, WebDrivers take a while, relatively to other tests. And again, apart from knowing the software engineering concepts, one concept I'd like to highlight, which I've seen many interns make a mistake on, is keep your test atomic. The whole point of having a test in the first place is to have the customer in here, representation of them, get a fast feedback. And if you, let's say a customer were to find the bug somewhere, and they were to file a bug with you, and they say, my website doesn't load. That doesn't explain anything to me. I'm going to spend time actually following up with the customer. What do you mean by doesn't load well? And then they say, oh, my search component is actually not loading. So the same would apply to the tests that you might write. I just tried test with a bunch of assertions of my website loading, of a search component loading, of a banner component loading. You want to decouple those, because ideally, you shouldn't even see the implementation of a test case. You just see the very name of it. And I'm a big proponent of keeping it descriptive. You just look at the name, and you already can start working and debugging the feature rather than debugging the test. If test is a burden, is basically killing the whole benefit of tests. A few don'ts I have to highlight. Don't fall into the extremes with the page objects. I think it's been highlighted before. in other talks. But by extremes, I mean don't make it too specific and don't make it too generic. As people mentioned before, having a one-page object, which is some container over 200 lines, might be an overkill. So you might want to use composition in here. Composition is perfect in these scenarios. And also, you might go way too specific by writing property editor for search, property editor for banner. You don't want to do that. You might want the caller, a certain component, to define the subtype of your property editor. So basically, keep that in mind. Then try not to reuse the same WebDriver session. There is almost no way to clean up your data perfectly. Just think about the analogy. If you had a pencil and a piece of paper, you were to write something on it, and you would erase it perfectly well. The paper still will be damaged. The same with the WebDriver sessions. Just bring up the new session. This is why you only bring it up for a short period of time over actual logic you're working on. So just start from the scratch. People mentioned explicit, implicit weights, and the whole reasoning behind. Actually, they said that it's going to be discussed in other topics, but it's a topic of its own. But the only one thing I'd like to highlight: don't use thread.weight. Unless you have a very sophisticated infrastructure, you might be stopping the entire suite, and it's not something you'd like to do. Find the ways. Use the WebDriver weight or something else, but try to avoid as much as possible. Avoid like fire. And last thing I'd just like to highlight: don't use WebDriver for everything. It's not a silver bullet. It's the right tool for the right problem. So let's cover example. People are usually learning well from the actual sample of things like that. So let's say I were given a new feature. Developer completed their feature work. I'll start with the review of the dev code. Ideally, before it gets even pushed to the main branch, I would actually be a part of a reviewer. So that actually implies that your technical ability and ability to read the code is, well, quite sophisticated. So what you actually have to look for, the first thing that I already mentioned, the agreement you had of adding those WebDriver-specific hooks. This is the very good place to give a comment on that. Why did you forget to do this? Please do so, because I'll have to do it. And ideally, you're not touching production code. You're working on a test branch. So keep that separation in mind. Then this is the point where you can do the first line of defense by finding bugs right off the bat, right in this code review. So if you see some issue because you know the code base, you knew where fixes for similar bugs happened, and you can actually bring it up as a developer. And another important point on this code reviews is that it gives you best description of a feature work and the ability to make sure that the done when, if you work in an agile, done when for the story or requirements that are going to come out of this feature are fulfilled, or even what those requirements might be. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you see an if condition like if title is empty string, do so. So that if statement might not be mentioned in the story itself because the developer thinks that's obvious. Where people will biased, we forget things. But by seeing the code, you yourself will actually, I'm probably going to test for that, for the empty string. And ideally, I'll also update the story done when, so everyone else knows about it. So let's say it was all perfect. We review the code. It gets pushed. Then I confirm selectors. So I don't want to use the WebDriver to confirm my selectors by just inspecting it on the web page. I personally prefer to use the Chrome developer tools before I go with WebDriver. So you can also find the better plugins for that. But basically, I'm just giving you a small tip of using $signs represents a CSS selector that's going to be copied one by one into your WebDriver page object. If you're using a single $sign, it's representing of an XPath that you might use one by one in your page objects. It's a nice tip that I actually like to use before I even try to run the WebDriver. And optionally, if you don't have abstraction for this feature, you're going to write some abstraction. Whatever you use, if it's a page object, you do so. And as I mentioned before, the JavaScript executors that provide you the ability to listen and wait for the call to be completed is something you might want to add into your test framework. So basically using JavaScript executor for certain listener that will wait for it to be completed, check the status of a call before proceeding with the search example that I gave before. It's a good thing to have. It's optional, but I'm trying to put as many points as possible for the worst case scenario. So what drives me nuts about WebDriver? I just like to complain a bit and share pain with you. Browser driver support, I find it not good enough. Like I think we had a panel yesterday where we said there were quite a few bugs which are well known, which has been around for over 5 years. I recently encountered a similar issue when I had to play with the console logs of a WebDriver, and there's the bug been around with the Google team for years now. And apparently there's just one lady that actively working on it, and I believe that this kind of support should be done in a much wider, larger team. Internet Explorer, I'd like to highlight this guy. This is the browser that creates most plugins in my tests. Apart from it being quite slow and some API not being supported, that's a driver I would not go with. As I mentioned before, you should be browser independent when you're writing tests, but there should be some favorite child where it's like in a family where you have like a couple of children. You kind of have one favorite, even though the other wouldn't know. So you usually go with the Chrome. Personally, I go with the Chrome driver when I write my tests, but when I actually going to ship it to run for all the browsers, including this Internet Explorer. And again, WebDriver is a relatively slow tests. It's not its fault. It's how it's been written for, and that's totally fine. But it's just something I'd like to complain as a software engineer. So why WebDriver tests? If there are some pain points that I just mentioned, why do we even have them? So, as I mentioned before, they give you the feedback. They are the best tool agile engineer can have. By agile engineer, I mean the engineer that works in the agile methodology and keeps the philosophy in mind. It's end-to-end testing. So you actually can go through the whole process from the point where you enter search term and you see the results and you might interact with the results. But the regression testing is that concerns me the most as an engineer myself is that by making a certain change, I might not know about some side effects of it, and by having the regression suite that runs continuously on my continuous integration before I actually make a submission is very important. Because you can't bring up the manual tests to test every single pull request that you make. You want to make as many of those as possible. That's the main idea. And those regression tests for other areas, other features that have been delivered before is a crucial thing. So consider alternatives. As I mentioned before, right tool for the right job. So if it's a UI tests, consider apply tools. Maybe you only care about visuals or SQLi for that sake, which is basically came before apply tools. Service tests. As I mentioned an example with a search, you might not need, if you wrote those service tests web service based, it's quite simple to use, and then you don't have to validate results during your WebDriver tests. So you can again speed them up. Integration tests. Use Makito, PowerMox in the worst case to represent some service that has to run during your integration test. Keep it simple. Performance tests. Please don't use WebDriver for performance testing. Maybe you have to for your specific use case, but usually you don't. Use Gatling, use JMeter. If you're more into programming, use Gatling. If you like declarative and UI and simple GUI, use the JMeter. And the unit tests, JUnit, TestNG, we all know about it. This pyramid you've probably seen a lot for the past few days. Again, the GUI tests on top, service tests in the middle, whether it's whatever way you call it, acceptance integration tests, lots of words for it. Unit tests. Of course, we don't have that. Some companies might have this pyramid this way, but majority are reversed. But it shouldn't concern you. If it is reversed, don't just play along. Be a champion. Make the change yourself. I like the idea of how React works. The thing is that you can basically create your own small empire of the React within almost any web JavaScript framework. So starting small, you expand, and then you show the benefit of it, and then hopefully the entire organization supports it. The same comes for this pyramid. You might, as a quality engineer, if you don't write features, hence you don't write unit tests, and possibly you're not making the support for service tests. But in that case, try to speak with your engineers, highlight the benefit, come up with the use cases from other companies out there. Basically, start small, but you're gonna get there. Make it your Everest, make it your goal. So to wrap it up, it's a good idea always to reiterate what you spoke about. I highlighted what the website builders are with some testing challenges that you get along the way. Some conceptual differences between two main contexts that you are working with, design time and the runtime contexts. The generalization of tests also was mentioned here, where you're working with the different toolkits or templates, different browsers, which shouldn't affect the way you write your code. Also, important part of this presentation was developers and testing. As I mentioned before, you have the same goal, high quality software. Focus on that, work on that together. You're not fighting with them. Some teams consider QEs to be bad guys. You're not a bad guy. You actually should work together in collaboration. It's all about collaboration. Then I gave a small example of writing a WebDriver test from the production code and what steps I follow to actually get to the pyramid that you've seen before, and a couple of nuances of WebDriver. So, a couple of final words. Write test code like you mean it. Even if the feature was poorly done, they don't follow the software principle, they don't do it dry, don't use keys, anything like that. You as a tester still should be using the best code you can, writing the best code you can, because you are in charge of your code. You should respect yourself and your work. Some people in the previous talks said that testers might be undermined and thought as lower level engineering or less technical than developers. If you are keeping this idea in mind, if you actually care about the craft you do, because it's a craft, you're an artist. You're not just a coder that makes like 100 types in a minute. As long as you think what you write, you're actually concerned about not just throwaway code. You're gonna be compensated well, I hope. Even if not monetary, in your current company, your experience will help you to proceed in your career, and you will be well compensated with whatever you're looking for: respect, good team, good manager. You should be great yourself before you can get there. So that's a few things I wanted to talk about. Now I have open questions, if there are any. You can ask me in the Russian or English. I will translate in the mic for everyone else in the auditorium. There is a person.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Do you test how your building application are displayed in runtime in one test or in one scenario, end-to-end scenario, I mean?
Sorry, I kind of got lost there.
You say there is design time and runtime.
Yes.
When you in design time finish it, then you can see in runtime what happens. I mean, do you use scenario from starting design time and finishing in runtime?
Rarely, I would say. As I mentioned, the test to keep it test atomic, you will most likely not do so. If you only focus on how the component behaves in the runtime, you're most likely going to focus just on that. So you write a case like this one. But if it's end-to-end testing, maybe there is one sanity check. You might do so. You might Start with the design time, modify a component, and then you get to the runtime. But ideally, so you actually should keep them separate, because it's separate scenarios, it's separate contexts. Yeah. Okay, doesn't sound like... Oh, there is a... Nice. I'm looking for questions.
Hello, thank you for your speech. I have a question. You said that the best practice is when QA and developer they are working together. For example, developer could make the work of QA more easy. But does it work? Because in this case, as far as I know, it could the time of release be more longer.
Sorry, what was the last statement?
I say that in this case, when they're working together, sometimes the time of release could be more than when without. They're working each from his side. Can I say Russia?
Yes, of course, you can.
Так будет проще. В данном случае говорю, что...
Can you get it closer? Yeah.
Я говорю, что вы говорили, что когда работают вместе Dev и QA, это как бы проще и быстрее. Но с другой стороны, я часто встречал, что ну, девелоперу, например, чтобы что-то сделать, ну, например, тоже прописать локатор, там нужно пройти через 7 кругов ада, там, в том числе и в процессе разработки. Например, это начиная от того, там, создать Jira Task, чтобы после этого ему заапровили это время, чтобы он все это сделал и так далее. И тебе самому, например, проще написать локаторы и так далее. То есть насколько такой метод бывает оправдан?
So the question was that by working with the developer closely, it's not necessarily easy. It's actually, there are difficulties along the ways and blockers like slow process where you have to submit a certain Jira ticket for a new production code to be created. So the main part is that does it worth developer writing those selectors and hooks, or you as a tester can actually do it yourself? Yes, it actually, the answer is yes, that it's beneficial enough. Any of those best practices out there are like, you have to go through the growing pain to basically make a change. As you said, if it's 9 cycles of hell, or whatever way it's translated to English, if it's like that in your organization, there is a problem. It should be fairly easy to make a change. But what I actually try to emphasize is, in the very first submission of a production code, the developer, him or herself, make the change in adding that extra WebDriver hook right off the bat. It's not a second pull request, it's a very first pull request. So if you already had the opening or had a ticket in Jira created, an extra class shouldn't bother you, or extra extra web service conditions also shouldn't impact your flow. So, but that's a problem. It's an actual issue in the process that's established in the company.
The problem is that sometimes when you see this problem, developers say, I can fix it, but at this moment I have a lot of other blocked tasks, and it could take about more than 1 month, 2 months, when the fix is just 1 or 2 minutes.
It all comes to the pyramid that I showed before. Developer also can ship a feature saying, I'm not writing unit tests because it takes time. I had this sprint, it's a Friday, I don't want to move my story to the next sprint because I haven't written unit tests. Yes, you do have to do that. If we all care about the same thing, the software, rather than finishing the story, you have to define a done when, the generic definition of being done with your feature. Because you're trying to get some level of quality there. It's not about you and developer living in 2 different worlds where you are the one concerned about the quality and that person concerns about shipping the features like a factory. They are not a factory, neither are you. You both are working on the same product, so there is no need for this separation and get further from each other. So that's the main idea, that there shouldn't be like it's too slow, there is no benefit. The main goal of this feature to be working. So they start slow and they get to the GUI tests.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, that's a question.
Thank you for the nice talk. I have a question about using JavaScript Executor, because as I know, it could be difficult to determine is that element visible, which clicked or not clicked, but clicked by JavaScript, or it's not visible. I mean, when you're using a WebDriver, you are really could be confident that user could interact with the web element. When you are using JavaScript Executor, you couldn't. Did you met any troubles with such case?
I mean, I know what you mean, because let's say you're trying to send the input data through the WebDriver. That one doesn't work, or you try to use JavaScript Executor to send the data to the input field. That actually works. There are different scenarios like that, and I haven't encountered issues with that. I mean, JavaScript Executor in this context, JavaScript Executor for regular flows should be avoided, my personal opinion. Like if it's an input field, there is no need to use the JavaScript Executor to make a web service call directly to the server to set the data or trigger some action. The only reason I bring up the JavaScript Executor here is that it's a perfect way to have a hook around your actions that you make through the WebDriver, not to trigger it, but to wait for it to be completed. So it means that it's like a functional interfaces in Java 8 that people may be familiar with, where you have a consumer that you can have a shell around it where you start the listener, so I know, and then in the middle you have the execution of that action. So what it means here, before I define a contract, that I know that in the action following this listener, it's going to trigger this web service. And I set the listener here, I set the logic here, and at the end, before I proceed with my work, I wait for the web service to complete its work, to have the function status to be set to complete its. So that's the main usage here.
Yeah, thank you. I also have used several times JavaScript to wait some completions on the page. And also, I have a question about avoiding of reusing WebDriver session. Because in my opinion, opening browser requires a lot of time, and sometimes it's better to just clean up cookies and use session again. Why it's a worse practice?
I think the speaker before me that was focused on Docker kind of mentioned that why he's waiting for Docker to come out is because when you start from the clean image, not just a WebDriver session, but from the completely clean image, you are certain that the test starts from the fresh point. It's almost like when you're writing tests, you are trying to make sure that you don't reuse static fields in your test case. You're making those be initialized in each individual test separately. The WebDriver is not any different. As much as you might assume that they are not going to affect each other, there's always going to be that one case, like 1%. And the problem is, it's almost with like security issues. It just takes one to happen, and the confidence is going to get lost. Your job is to make sure to write tests and keep them as a final confidence check. And if your manager that actually doesn't care how it's written, or whoever the whoever is working with those tests, seeing that your tests are failing because the way you wrote them, it's going to be a problem. If tests take time to debug them and fix them, not because of an underlying app issue, there is a big underlying concern. So coming back to your question, If the cause of a test failures is the fact that you try to save some milliseconds of bringing up the new browser, if it takes too long, there is again a problem in the way the infrastructure is set up. And maybe if you write in the test atomic enough, the reason you run those tests in the first place for your work is only needed for this specific scenario. You don't have to run 5 tests. You, as a developer, running just one because you're working on this one area. If it's automatically running on your CI, you don't care how long it takes, unless it takes days. Like with our infrastructure at Salesforce, we have thousands and thousands of tests which are run separately from our submissions. So it takes hours and days, but we're not really concerned about the milliseconds because they become so irrelevant to the number of test cases. So start from the fresh paper.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.